This is a podcast sponsored by To Enlighten Research. I'm Sara Siqueira. In this new episode, Amanda and I will talk about selecting the outcome of clinical research. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you, Sara. Another great topic today.
Yeah, Amanda, we know that a good plan step is the core of clinical research. From the research question, the selection of the study design, the statistical analysis, the safety and ethical issues, all steps are fundamental. Likewise, the selection of the right outcome focused on clinical trials must be precisely to provide the relationship among the variables to better bring answers regarding the intervention and the impact in the patient's life. So the choice of the outcome must be valid, relevant, precise, reliable, proper, accepted, achievable, feasible, realistic for the research question. Hence, this step requires careful choice.
Very good, Sara. The endpoint can directly measure the clinical outcome, such as measurable change in health, function, or quality of life, mortality, improvement in symptoms, drug-induced renal function as a measure to adverse effect, etc. On the other hand, the endpoint can be a substitute or surrogate for the clinical outcome in a study, such as blood pressure for hypertension, left ventricular fraction for heart failure, lung function for asthma, etc. When selecting the surrogate endpoint, it is important to account on its strength, consistency, specificity, temporality, dose responsiveness, plausibility, coherence, analogy, experimental evidence.
Exactly, Amanda. The primary outcome measure is the outcome that is considered the most important to the study. It must be chosen at the time of the study design to avoid false positive error, and also it is used to estimate the sample size, which is critical to avoid false negative error due to insufficient statistical power. Ideally, it must be statistically significant and clinically significant. I like the key points when choosing the primary endpoint suggested by Iwashina and McPeak in the study from 2018. So, quoting the authors, your intervention should change your primary outcome. The primary outcome should be carried about by your audience. The primary outcome should be relevant to patients. The primary outcome should be measured efficiently. The primary outcome should be measured reliably. And when possible, use a well understood continuous scale. Now, the secondary endpoints can also evaluate additional effects of the intervention on the disease or the condition, or it can assess toxicity and adverse effects. Moreover, it is increasing the knowledge about mechanistic secondary endpoints in which, if it demonstrated that the intervention can modify, for instance, the physiology of the disease, even when failed to reach the primary endpoint, this information can bring a causal pathway that remains incompletely known. Here, it is also important to remember that statistical testing of secondary outcomes can be related to increased type 1 and type 2 error.
Indeed, Sara, it is a universe of outcomes, and quoting the mentioned authors, all clinical trials are exercise of the art of the possible. End quote. But let's try to make this art of possible the most accurate with the best choice for our trials.
Brilliantly, Amanda. After this great introduction, let's talk about Dr. Escorpeta challenge. He is seeking a novel treatment for stroke and consequently he wants to impact positively in millions of stroke survivors. However, he realized that not only finding the novel intervention, but here it is also essential to choose the most accurate measurement instrument to evaluate this intervention in his stroke recovery research.
Correct, Sara. Here, as in any other trial, a bad selection of the outcome can ruin the study. For stroke studies, a better measurement is the key for a better track of stroke survival patients' improvement, which is sometimes very difficult to be observed. In Dr. Scoperta's opinion, an attempt to overcome this challenge is starting by focusing on motor recovery after stroke and to assess it by a measurement tool that can provide a good perception of patients' improvement.
Important to address that a previous measure called Figo-Meyer assessment of motor recovery after stroke demonstrated several limitations, and other measurements were developed.
Absolutely, Sarah. Let's now take a look at the comment of our wonderful and dear expert neurologist and stroke researcher Jan from Germany. This is an example that he texted. Quote, a patient who has a right hemispheric infarction, the left side of the body will be affected depending on the extent. Let's further imagine that this patient has only one drop in the leg hold test over 5 seconds. So he will receive points for this depending on the scale. The more points, the higher the deficit. In the course, we now register that the patient now has pronation of the left arm and the arm's hold test. This is not depicted in any scale that I know of, but it formally represents a deterioration. End quote. From him, Sarah, we could learn that despite the National Institute of Stroke and Health Scale (NIHSS) is commonly used in clinical settings and can better comprise deficits evaluation, even so, it fails to detect some other aspect as well. Besides, he addresses a standardized measure called Modified Rankin Scale, which is the selected scale for study settings when choosing to assess neurological impairment, dimension of disability after stroke, and also it is a validated approach to be assessed by telephone.
Perfect, and this is in fact a great advantage, which can turn into a practical way to evaluate patients out of hospital, especially considering the ones with mobility deficits. Another interesting aspect to consider is the challenge when comparing stroke scales, classified as clinical metric scales, functional impairment, handicap scales.
You're right, Sarah. Previous retrospective review pointed out the advantage of the modified National Institute of Health Stroke Scale and Scandinavian Stroke Scale when compared to NIHSS because they can be more simple and less affected due to inter-rater variability. Also, it reported that the modified Rankin Scale and Bartle Index are the most used functional impairment and disability scales. Important to note that differences among the grades of modified Rankin Scale were considered not well defined. Besides, another disability scale evaluated in this review was the Asian Stroke Disability Scale, which comprises a simplified functional impairment and handicap scale, and it was considered as valid as modified Rankin Scale and Bartle Index. It concluded showing that NIHSS and Modified Rankin Scale and Bartle Index are the most used in stroke routine settings.
Beautiful, Amanda. A previous study published on stroke reported that for acute stroke trials, the NIHSS scale was more sensitive than the Bartle Index or modifier ranking scale, and also suggested that the use of NIHSS prognosis adjusted endpoint in order to more easily reach drugs' therapeutic effects.
It's so nice to learn, Sarah. Well, stroke scales are an important research topic. Here in our country, Brazil, researchers from Bahia developed a scale called the Hospital Mobility Scale for cases of acute stroke scenario, and it was validated compared to modified Rankin Scale. Moreover, researchers from Minas Gerais also reported that Able-Ocock Brazil questionnaire was reliable when assessing locomotion ability after stroke by telephone interview.
In fact, Dr. Escoperto research can be a game changer. Stroke is one of the main causes of disability and death in the entire world. The stroke survivors commonly present loss of psychological, physiological, or anatomical function, lost to impairments in their basic activity, daily living, and in their quality of life. So, assessments on motor functioning, defined motor functions, sensory functioning, balance, joint range of motion and pain, strength, extremities function, mobility, productivity, communication, thinking, memory, emotion, neuropsychiatric impacts such as mood disorders, depression, anxiety, apathy, and also personality, social participation, self-care, family roles, and in all expected sequelae due to a stroke is important to a better evaluation of patient's improvement or deterioration.
Wonderful, Sarah. It is important to note that there is a growing interest in evaluating patient based outcome measures for clinical trials, and it is also approved by the important regulatory agencies. From these questionnaires, it is possible to capture information about the disease, about the treatment related symptoms, and it is possible to assess the severity and frequency of the symptoms, side effects, etc. According to Fitzpatrick and colleagues, for any research, it is crucial to select it, quote, according to the appropriateness, reliability, validity, responsiveness, precision, interpretability, acceptability, and feasibility, end quote. However, it is challenged to extract the patient's perception of the disease and the selected outcomes in clinical intervention trials. Important to address that also can exist a gap in the head-to-head patients reported outcome studies.
Exactly, Amanda. Even when focusing only on motor functioning, the scales comprise different aspects and no one globally assesses these characteristics. Hence, Dr. Scoperta can start becoming a game rearranger using more different scales that include different aspects of motor functioning and that way try to overcome the lack of aspects that one unique scale cannot provide. Furthermore, it is possible to create a new scale more detailed in which he can include aspects that are expected to be found when assessing motor functioning in stroke survivors, according to previous studies, daily practice, and expert opinion, and then he can try to validate it as the examples from Brazilian research.
Perfect, Adam. Besides, Dr. Scoperta can start assessing motor functioning and then he can also ameliorate other outcome measures that are also important when trying to evaluate the patient globally with all impacts that stroke can cause, as mentioned before. Thus, any increase in a measure of outcome in clinical research is indeed a victory. Here, Dr. Scoperta will not only play the game, but he indeed will change the game.
To validate the new scale, it is necessary to test it as a study. It is possible to start as a pretest to evaluate if there is any pitfall and to correct it. Open-ended questions often is used in pilot phase and closed-ended questions to finalize. The validation process can occur by judgment in which is verified the logical and accurate validity if the content fulfill the purpose and the consensual validity by experts. Another method is comparing against previous data to validate the instrument in which is necessary to evaluate criteria validity, conversion and discriminant validity to check the new instrument against other, and it's also possible to construct validity when checking the new scale against a related variable. Besides, the new instrument can be validated as predicted validity when measured against a future event, and it can be validated to check responsiveness when tested in different situations. After this part, it is also important to further evaluate if the scale reflects a validation to one specific population or if it is representative to a generalizable population. It was an excellent talk, Amanda. Thanks for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening.